So, welcome everyone. Just let a couple people who are just joining connect and then we'll be underway. But thank you very much for coming on time and we'll get going. So thank you very much for coming. We welcome a couple of Salzburg Global Fellows in the audience and a few people who are new to Salzburg Global Seminar. My name is Charles Ehrlich. I'm a program director at Salzburg Global Seminar. And as we say this every time, we really wish we could greet you in person. Things are opening up. We hope to see you in person in our palace in Salzburg very soon. But we also value the fact that this format allows more of you to join us from your own homes comfortably as well. For those who do not know us, a short introduction about Salzburg Global Seminar. We are an independent, not-for-profit organization founded in 1947, so it's our 75th anniversary. We challenge current and future leaders to shape a better world. For the last 75 years, whether at our home of Schloss Leopoldskron, or online or in locations around the world, our retreat-like programs have provided a forum for global exchange and transformation. Our inspiring environment, remote from the day-to-day buzz, allows participants from across the globe to come together and speak candidly, learn from each other, and return to your communities, organizations, and companies with renewed purpose and fresh perspective. Our focus is on tough issues that require cross-sector and interdisciplinary dialogue and the space to step back and explore innovative approaches. We convene diverse voices from across generations, geographies, and sectors, which would otherwise not likely have a chance to exchange views. Together, our fellows create outside-the-box solutions and expand their networks in unprecedented ways. Our focus is on addressing challenging questions that benefit from cross-sector and interdisciplinary dialogue and require the headspace to step back and explore innovative approaches. The three areas we focus on are rule of law and social trust, long-term and sustainable development, and creative and healthy societies, sometimes all at once. Today is, as you know, not one of our usual programs, but rather it's an opportunity to introduce some of our recent work on a very important topic and to invite our fellows working on other subjects and the general public to become involved with these efforts as we continue to move forward. This is a program that was originally conceived and designed before the outbreak of COVID-19 in discussions we had with 3 US-based partners. And we thank the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, and the David Rockefeller Fund for all their support and encouragement as we have moved forward, particularly under the changed circumstances caused by the pandemic. We saw for many years now in many countries, there's a growing recognition that effective criminal justice reform needs to look beyond the usual toolkit and institutions of the criminal justice system itself. We also recognize the pivotal contribution that global exchange could make to criminal justice reform efforts, including the seeding of new strategies around the world. Because of the pandemic, we've only run this program virtually since the beginning of 2021. We've ultimately brought together 67 Salzburg Global Fellows from 19 countries into small interlocking working groups. We looked for points of intervention and big, potentially transformative ideas that could help shape the future of criminal justice systems. In addition to just mixing people from backgrounds traditionally engaged in criminal justice, we also brought in fellows from education, health, business, media, and cultural spheres. The rich learnings from our workshop and throughout 2021 are summarized in our report. And if you've not seen it already, Antonia, my colleague, will put a copy in the chat. I may say that for those of you watching the video on YouTube or on our website after this event, and you don't have access to the chat, all the links will be posted on our website and linked from the YouTube channel as well, so that those of you watching later will also have a chance to see all the rich discussions and links that are happening in that area. Our report, which is online, is designed in a web-based format to be accessible, so dive right in. It has summary key takeaways, examples, recommended resources, and we will continue to highlight these examples through short reports, interview features, social media stories, and videos with our fellows. The next phase of the multi-year initiative includes this series of 5 public webinars, of which this is the 3rd, to identify some of the most promising global examples of violence reduction and criminal justice transformation proven through research to be effective, viable, and replicable. Today, we examine data-driven criminal justice reform. And we're looking very closely at the research. So we have 4 eminent researchers with us today, and we're very pleased that they can present some of what they've been doing. We want to look specifically, what is the research telling us? There's a description, there's an analysis, there's a question of what is left to be learned. So after this research, what questions need to be answered? And most importantly, and we'll get to this today, how do we get decision makers to care? So it's great to have research. How do we seed that into the answer? And of course, how do we make sure that what is happening at the grassroots, that the communities that are affected by violence, that they themselves have a voice that is passed on to the researchers and then passed on to the policymakers, who are not necessarily the same people as the ones who are the stakeholders in the society affected by change. We also recognize that the same facts may lead to different conclusions. So this is yet another reason to have this discussion with a very broad group. And so as we move forward after these 5 webinars this spring, and in the coming years, we will invite policymakers, public officials, and activists in positions able to spearhead new reforms to join us for those next round of conversations and actions starting later this year. So today's format, we have, as I said, 4 very important researchers that we'd like to highlight. Hadar, Dancig-Rosenberg, and Joshua Kleinfeld are working together, and they will give one presentation about their work. There will be some questions and answers specifically on what they present, so a chance to ask them directly. Then we'll move on to Peter Dixon, and again, there'll be a set of time for questions and answers directly related to his work. Then we will have Michal Gilad, and again, questions and answers directly related to her work. And that will leave us about half an hour at the end for general discussion and questions. And we've brought so many of you into the room so that you can actually see each other and it feels a little more intimate. We encourage you in the meantime, during the presentations, to post your questions in a chat box, and we'll look at those questions and bring them up or call on you as we go on, so that you can come into the conversation. But there's no reason you can't be chatting about them in the side during this. So global conversations are very good for local impact. So think about where you come from and whether the research that's presented today, is this applicable where you're from? What can you learn from it? And who else do you think should come along this journey with us? So with no further ado, I'm very happy to hand over to Hadar and Joshua, and Hadar will be giving the presentation of their work. Hadar.
Great, thank you so much, Charles, for this introduction, and good morning, everyone from Berkeley. Thank you for organizing this seminar and this series of very important conversations. In the next minutes, I'll present a new study that I've been conducting with Professor Josh Kleinfeld of Northwestern University Law School, which deals with the question of what is the metric by which to measure a well-functioning criminal justice system. But before delving into this question, I think it's worth saying a word on the important role that metrics plays in modern states today. So just let me, okay. When we look at the modern state and the way it operates, we can immediately notice that the modern state is a number-bound enterprise for good and ill. It measures performance almost always by counting something. But metrics do not just measure. They also structure incentives, they determine the allocation of resources, and they translate values into bureaucratic operating procedures. In a great book, James Scott highlights the power of metrics to redefine what governments care about. To measure populations for purposes of conscription, land for purposes of taxation, or any other project of statecraft, governments must divide the social world into categories that are legible from bureaucratic point of view. These categories are necessary simplification of a more complex social reality. But once the state has put its power behind a categorization scheme, the world changes to fit these categories. People reclassify themselves to avoid conscription. Property systems bend to minimize taxation. In other words, the metric used to measure the world alter what they were meant not only to measure, because what the state sees determines the flow of power, and that power restructures the social world. This urge to quantify and to measure, and the power of the state metrics to reshape the things that they measure, is part of the human condition in the modern age. And this insight brought Josh and I to think together how to leverage metrics power in the criminal justice context in a way that will least distort and most productively reshape the social institutions that we care about. As criminal law scholars, we started to think what metrics could both illuminate whether a criminal system is functioning well, and in doing so, bring out the best in it. We started from the slide, just trying to move the slide. Doesn't work for some reason. Can you see that? Okay, yeah. So we started by looking at existing metrics that are in use today. And it turns that 6 metrics dominate criminal law. Crime rates, conviction rates, arrest rates, clearance rates, recidivism rates, and monetary cost. The things those metrics measure, how much crime there is, how many people are being arrested, etc., are of course important. But every one of those metrics, whether singly or in combination one with another, create a significant and misleading picture of whether the criminal justice system is functioning well, and sometimes a misleading picture of the very things that the metrics themselves are supposed to illuminate.
Hadar,
More than this, yes.
I'm so sorry. The slides don't seem to be moving. Can you advance to slide 2?
Oh,
and
of
if
course.
not,
so
maybe Antonia can take over. I can take over.
Okay, so I don't know why it happens. Let me see. Is it a share? You see the share screen? The share screen?
Yeah, right now we're seeing a frozen screen, which is just the cover page of your PowerPoint.
Oh, so Antonia, would you like to get in?
There we go.
It doesn't work here.
All right.
Yeah.
Back to you, Hadar.
Okay. So Antonia?
Sure. Okay.
Now can you see that? I'm trying to. Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Oh,
I'm sorry about that. I don't know why it happened.
Well, now we're back on slide number 1. I don't know quite why. Can we advance to slide number 2 or 3?
I am trying.
For a moment, I saw it. There it is.
Okay, great.
All right.
Yeah. Okay, so this was what I said about the role of metrics in modern states, and then we continue to speak about the current existing metrics that we can recognize today in use in criminal law. And what I was saying is that when you look at these metrics, either singly or in combination one another, you see that none of them really gives like an accurate picture of whether the criminal justice system is functioning well or not. And just for example, if you look at the metric of convictions rates, the metric is commonly used to assess prosecutors' performance. They measure the proportion of people found guilty once prosecutors have decided to file charges. But the effect that the metric creates is incentivizing prosecutors to focus on easy to prove cases rather than socially serious cases. And since the most certain conviction is plea deals, it encourages excessive and sometimes unsavory forms of plea bargaining. Or let's look at another example, crime rates. Crime rates are commonly used also to evaluate police forces, but the problem is that crime rates are affected by such a complex array of societal factors beyond policing, like poverty, broken families, poor mental health systems, etc., that it's perfectly impossible for a community, it's perfectly possible for a community to have high crime notwithstanding good policing, or low crime notwithstanding bad policing. So what Josh and I realized is that there is currently no good metric by which to measure criminal justice outcomes. But because modern governments cannot subsist without metrics, the dearth of good metrics just means misleading metrics. And here come our idea. Antonia, you can move the slide. We propose to adopt a metric based on the concept of social trust. Social trust refers to an individual's beliefs about general trustworthiness of other people, social institutions, and governments. It's actually not a novel concept at all, but that's exactly what makes it a strong idea. Social trust has been extensively studied in economics, political science, sociology. It has proven to be one of the best predictors of overall societal well-being known to social science. Once one becomes familiar with the existing literature about social trust, the only surprising thing about connecting it to the criminal justice system is that so few have done so before. Next slide. So as we use the term in the context of criminal justice, social trust refers to 3 dimensions. The first is the level of trust policies members have towards institutions, officials, laws, actions that comprise the criminal justice system. Second dimension is the level of trust policies members have in virtue of the criminal system's operation towards government generally. And the third dimension is the level of trust policies members have towards one another following incidents of crime and responses to crime. What Josh and I practically propose is to construct a tool by which to measure people's responses to the operation of the criminal system along these 3 dimensions. For example, someone who is a crime victim or a witness or community stakeholders or even an offender, they might get a survey in the wake of a contact with the criminal justice system asking whether that contact increased or decreased her sense of trust in the criminal justice system, in government generally, in other people. Next slide, please. Our central claim is that a well-functioning criminal justice system is one whose operation increases people's sense of trust along these 3 lines, whereas a poorly functioning criminal justice system is one whose operation diminishes trust along one or more of these 3 dimensions. In other words, what Josh and I are trying to say is that the marginal effects on social trust should be the key measure of whether a criminal system is functioning well or poorly. Thus, in criminal justice, the output that are most important to measure and to incentivize is something effective and interpersonal and not material. Having said that, I would just clarify that these claims are not as absolute as they may sound. First, we're not arguing that other metrics should be done away with. The way that social trust fits the other metrics is more nuanced than that. Second, we're not arguing for pure maximization of social trust. Of course, we think that the distribution of trust also matters, especially in conditions of an alienated racial minority. And that principle, that basic justice constrain the maximization of trust. Please, next slide. In a new article, we explain in detail what virtues a criminal justice metric based on social trust would have. We show that beyond altering criminal justice officials' incentives in the right way, social trust is also a locus of agreement among cacophony of different goals that people bring to the criminal justice system. It speaks equally to crime control and to community solidarity, to retributive justice, to racial justice. It's neither tough on crime or soft on crime. Everyone in criminal justice has a reason to care about social trust. Next slide, please. I'd like to finish with saying a word about practicability, how our suggestion can be implemented so that it would have practical policy impact. That's actually the focus of our webinar here today. A metric that works for governments must be reasonably straightforward and inexpensive to assess. It must be quantifiable. It must make sense to criminal justice officials. It must apply to different parts and stages of the criminal process, and it must give officials information that translates to action. Social trust has that flexibility, we believe, and capaciousness, making virtually every aspect of the criminal justice system subject to a common standard of evaluation based on a relatively simple set of survey questions. The sweeping simplicity of social trust metric, a few questions that can be asked at any stage of the criminal justice process and that will thereby provide information useful to action, is key to getting policy change. The focus of this presentation today was, mostly on why social trust is the right thing to measure. But of course, the question of how to do that, that's actually where Josh and I are focusing now when we're starting to get into our next stage. Next slide, please, last one. The basic thought, as I mentioned, is to use survey techniques to ask people who have recent encounters with the criminal justice system, whether the experience left them with more or less trust in criminal justice, its officials, the government generally, and their fellow citizens. If you got a ticket or reported a crime or in any other way encountered the criminal justice system, you will get a follow-up survey assessing how your level of trust was affected by this encounter. Here you can see, some possible questions that Josh and I started to think about that could be included in such a survey. For example, to what extent do you feel that justice was done in this case? How fairly do you feel the officials involved in the case behaved? It reminds a bit question from studies about procedural justice. but here you see more. How respectfully do you feel criminal justice officials involved in this case behave? How do you feel? Do you feel more or less trust in your government now that this case has concluded? Do you feel more or less trust in your fellow citizens now that this case has concluded? And how much would you trust officials in future cases in which you would stay? So these are only examples. Much remains to be done to make a survey instrument of this kind of reality. We plan to focus on developing such a tool and collaborate with some policymakers to use it as a pilot to see how it works and to make it a reality. Thank you very much. Next slide. The last one. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Hadar. Josh, I'll throw it over to you since you've worked on this together with Hadar. But maybe a question for you, Joshua, to start you off. In the report that we put on our website that sort of catalogs the work we've been doing in the last year, and in the very short 5-minute film that Antonia will be able to put up in the chat link for those who haven't seen it, you are specifically saying that the measure of social trust is the biggest single predictor of homicide rates. And if you take homicide rates as as just one statistic, but of course, how people feel about crime, how safe they feel is very important. We found that in some of the other working groups, the non-researcher-based working groups. So I guess it sounds very simple. You increase social trust and homicide rates go down. But can you talk about how your research is actually linking the two and how they are connected?
Sure. Well, one of the fascinating things about social trust is its effect on crime rates. Of course, there's a lot of research by a lot of people from different fields, from criminology and sociology and psychology, and indeed history and economics, about what factors influence the crime rate. And to us, I don't mean to say this is a sole factor. By no means is it the sole factor, but to an overwhelming extent, to a surprising extent, social trust seems predictive. The stats you were referring to come from a magisterial study of homicide across place and time by Randolph Roth. So Randolph Roth is a social scientific and empirically oriented, a data-oriented historian who has studied homicide rates across American history. America has always had a fairly high homicide rate, but also homicide rates in other countries at other times, in France during the revolutionary years, in France during the Napoleonic years, in English villages in medieval times, and across place and time. And it turns out that measured levels of social trust, to the extent we have the measurements, are highly predictive of homicide rates. And the reasons are interesting. It turns out that there's a component of homicide that involves essentially people killing in relationships that have become toxic. And that level of killing, a rivalry between two friends or between romantic partners, some sort of toxic relationship leading to homicide, is fairly stable across place and time. The variable in homicide rates has to do with men's propensity to kill unrelated adults in acts of predation, lying in wait for them on the street or something, and in a robbery, or in sudden arguments over respect that explode into violence. But typically, male acts of aggression against other unrelated adults that do not have a long relational history are the primary variant in homicide across place and time. And it is highly correlated with the level of social trust they feel toward their government and towards their fellow citizen. It turns out that a number of other strands of research confirm this finding. For example, research about whether people believe their justice system is just, their criminal system is just, predicts levels of crime rates. Whether they feel they're treated fairly by the government predicts levels of violence. Whether they feel their government is legitimate predicts level of violence. It turns out that ambient levels of social trust are at least one major factor in crime rates. If I can back up and answer your question from a different perspective, one of the things I like about this project that Hadar and I are executing together is that it is the intersection of some public safety oriented thinking and some humanity to offenders oriented thinking. So Hadar and I come from very different perspectives on crime and punishment. If I, Hadar, not to put words in your mouth, Hadar's more of a soft on crime sort and I'm more of a tough on crime sort. I would emphasize public safety, personal responsibility, and moral wrongdoing when I think about crime, and Hadar would emphasize other sorts of factors. And what we find fascinating about social trust is that it is the intersection of those two concerns. It's very, there's good reason to believe that measuring social trust will reduce crime, and good reason to believe that it'll cause criminal justice officials to behave more kindly or more humanely to offenders and others. That is durable criminal justice reform, the meeting point of public safety and other concerns.
Peter, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Charles, and thank you so much, Josh and Hadar. I've appreciated hearing about your work so far in this project, and very much enjoyed the presentation. And I have a number of questions. I'm trying to just choose two of them. And I think that my presentation that I'm about to give will show actually a lot of intersections between our work, and it makes me think, you know, and I think your examples of potential questions to measure social trust sort of inspire this question. But I'm just curious to hear more about, if you've had a chance to unpack a bit the elements of social trust that deal with people's immediate relations within the family or to their neighbors or to their communities versus feelings, relations to sort of an abstract government or actual officials in a criminal justice system. I've sort of heard those kind of three dimensions, I think you've mentioned, of where social trust or a sense of social trust comes from. So I'm just curious to hear if you've had a chance to kind of map those out a bit or deconstruct them to see whether certain dimensions are more important than others, whether it's really sort of the whole package that matters. And then just the second question is, you know, I do a lot of survey work and have really lately been thinking about alternative or complementary forms of measurement to surveys and population surveys. Since surveys, you know, are sort of one very powerful way to measure and to count, and also kind of a technocratic language that policymakers understand and speak, but also can miss, you know, certain elements of very complex realities such as social trust. So I'm just be curious if you thought about other potential forms of measurement to possibly integrate this into an actual criminal justice system.
Hadar, you want to tackle this one?
You can start. I'll add. Yeah.
So the research on social trust typically relies on two dimensions of measurement. One is how much do you trust your government, its laws, and so on? How much do you trust the state officials? And the other is how much do you trust your fellow citizen or your fellow human being? So it's a sort of, I think of it as horizontal and vertical. There's how much do you trust other people around you and how much do you trust the government reigning over you? We decided to add a third dimension because we thought it might be interesting to assess people's feelings towards the officials and actions and laws that comprise the criminal justice system. So how do you feel about the police? You know, you've just been stopped and given a ticket, or you just saw someone get stopped and given a ticket. How do you feel about policing in your community? We thought that would be interesting. We need to develop a survey instrument and start beta testing. That's the next step. And it is possible that we'll find that these three dimensions sort of move consistently together, or that one of them seems more illuminating than the other two, or that there's some need for a fourth dimension. And so we're sort of an open mind about whether we need all three or some additional or fewer. I think there's a lot. I would actually love to talk with you about it since you have done survey work. But I think there's a lot to do to get the instrument kind of working properly. And as you say, speaking the technocratic language that governments want to speak. Could you remind me of your second question? I was so fixated on the first that I just blanked on the second.
Just, you know, if you've had a chance to think about complementary forms of measurement in addition to survey.
Oh, yeah. I was thinking about one. I was thinking about propensity to call 911 when you're in trouble. Like basically you can, if you want to figure out what people's level of social trust is, you can do two things, right? You can ask them how much they trust other people, or you can look for some behavior that reflects their levels of trust. And in the criminal justice context, I was thinking that their whether they turn to the police when they have some need or some emergency could be a pretty good indicator of whether they trust the police to do the right thing. Again, I'm open to suggestion if you have other ideas.
So Peter, I would just say also that, that in this stage, I think that Josh and I are standing exactly, on a way that we're moving from developing the philosophical principle idea, social trust to translate it into something very feasible, very practical. And we thought about a survey because we just thought that, that would be able to give, to speak in big numbers. You want to get a picture consists of big numbers, right, of respondents to get a sense of, tendencies. That's how you can also have segmentations and see, which groups tend more to have high social trust, which groups maybe tend more to have less social trust. It can tell you a lot about, racial justice, about some kind of hierarchies within the community. And to your first question, I would say that, it's a great question. Why actually we decided, or we thought about these three trajectories, three dimensions, when it's very intuitive to think about, the criminal justice authorities. These, of course, are very intuitive entities to think about. This is the contact. The contact was within the criminal justice system, so it's very, even studies about procedural justice. They ask people, right? How did they experience the contact with the law authorities, and that affects their perception of legitimacy, which can affect their compliance. So this first trajectory was very, very intuitive for us to think about. But then, I think the development here was to try to take it further, also to think about governments. We see the criminal justice system agents as representatives of the government in general. And we think that the potential of this contact of people with the criminal justice system also to affect how people, experience the government in general, what do they think about the government in general, is really high. So this kind of contact has a very, high potential to affect how people perceive themselves and their relationship with government in general. And also we went, to check how they feel about their fellow citizens, because it's all about social solidarity. Criminal justice, we believe, Josh and I, it's about criminal solidarity. It's about, our willingness to try to build again, rebuild these social ties. So it was also very intuitive for us to think about more interpersonal relationship between individuals and to connect to the idea of the criminal justice system. But we'll see, maybe like Josh said, we'll see that, one of these trajectories less,
I would hate to cut you off here, but this is an answer to Peter's question. So Peter, it's sort of cutting into your time. But I think it does make a really nice segue to what Peter is about to present. There are some comments in the chat, which I'd like you to have a look at and think about. There's something from Neely Gesser suggesting works by John Laub. There's a question from Graham Robb, which I don't think we should answer right now, because I think the other presentations will also address this, and we can wrap that up in the general questions at the end of the program. But I just want to make sure that we flag that for everybody on what Graham asks. So I hand over to Peter. I will also say, just for those who want to know more, there is something in our report about this. This stems from a year of working groups that we had in 2021. And we actually produced a very short 5-minute video, which I think gets the message across very well, which I'm putting a link in the, oops, I sent it only to Antonia, but Antonia will put the link in the chat in a minute. And that's, you're welcome to share that and think about it and be back in touch with us on that. So, but I will hand over to Peter, because I think it is a really good segue to your research.
Great, thanks so much, Charles. And I just wanted to, before I launch into my PowerPoint, say that I had the pleasure of actually interning at the Salzburg seminar 22 years ago, and got to live in the Schloss Leopoldsgrün for 3 months, the best 3 months of my college career. And so very happy to be back as a fellow participating in this project. So I am going to present on ongoing research. This project started towards the beginning of 2021 and is underway, is well underway. It's been a bit delayed by the pandemic, simply because the actual data we will be collecting relies on bringing small and large groups of people together in closed spaces to talk about very complex issues for a couple hours, which is precisely the kind of research you don't want to be doing during a pandemic. So we've had to delay it, think about alternative strategies to hold online discussions. But now that things seem to be calming down, we actually have a few of these focus groups scheduled for the upcoming months. So the project is called Everyday Indicators for Policy Innovation. And I'm going to speak about the two sides of that title, both what everyday indicators are and how we, because I'm working with a team here, are trying to test their relevance for policy innovation, specifically in terms of criminal justice reform and criminal justice policies. We are part of a larger initiative called California 100, which is a relatively new initiative taking place across the state of California to envision what they're proposing to be the next 100 years of social policy across about a dozen or so different policy fields, including criminal justice reform and public safety. We're specifically working in within a branch of this initiative called the innovation branch, the innovation stream, which is looking for alternative or complementary ways both to understand policy problems and to confront them. And so we're specifically looking at alternative and complementary forms to measurement, which is why I've been participating in this project and what I'll speak about today. And as you'll see, I think the starting point that I have with this research is quite similar to what Hadar and Josh were presenting in terms of what the problem is. What we our starting point with this work is that the way a social problem is measured, as I think Hadar communicated much more eloquently than I will, heavily influences the range of possibilities that especially policymakers can think about in terms of addressing that social problem. So taking the example of so-called public safety. Often, as we've heard, public safety is measured through indicators like crime statistics, homicide rates, recidivism. And these are very valid and very important metrics. But the problem is that they can significantly narrow the range of policy options and solutions to deal with problems of crime, violence, et cetera. And so in a system where public safety is equated to crime statistics, that essentially often biases policy solutions towards things like policing and criminal justice. So there are sort of two issues that we tend to see with this. One is more of a moral and ethical argument that those impacted by social problems and proposed solutions are often left out of the policy process when social problems like public safety are defined this way. As well as a pragmatic argument, which is that as Hadar and Josh were saying, that traditional measurement systems often bias policy processes towards downstream problems, such as fighting crime and violence, and away from many of the upstream causes, such as basic needs, housing, mental health, and all of the other policy fields that a more of a public health approach to criminal justice would highlight. And so in this project, we have a few different research questions that are guiding us towards addressing these problems. We're looking specifically at what community safety and community well-being look like when measured from the perspective of communities themselves, especially those communities most heavily impacted by injustice and inequity. So how do communities themselves actually define safety and actually define well-being in their everyday lives? And then what is the impact of public safety reform when measured according to these everyday indicators or everyday measurements of community safety and well-being? These are two more of the kind of research questions guiding our work. And then there are a couple more policy questions that we have, which are how do these so-called everyday indicators, and I'll speak about what I mean by those, actually influence the policy process? Can policy processes actually be informed by the everyday lived experiences of community members? And finally, what alternative policy solutions do everyday community indicators suggest that are not already being tried, particularly in this field of criminal justice reform? So unfortunately, I don't have answers to these questions yet. So what I'm going to speak mostly about today is the research design and really kind of more of the theoretical underpinning that we're working with. So everyday indicators is an approach that I and a number of other colleagues have been using in a number of contexts, actually around the world, including now in California, which is on the surface quite a simple methodological approach to essentially bring people together in intimate spaces and ask them what a particular complex concept looks like in their everyday lives. So I come actually from the field of peace and conflict studies and started out doing this specifically looking at issues of peace and reconciliation in post-conflict and conflict-affected countries. And in that work, we would work mostly in rural areas, mostly at the village level, organizing focus groups and community town halls to bring people together and ask, what does peace look like in everyday life? With the goal of essentially generating these everyday indicators of peace or everyday indicators of reconciliation that are relevant to people in their everyday lives, in their very hyper-local communities in which they're living and interacting on a daily basis. There are, so this everyday peace indicators process is now an actual NGO called Everyday Peace Indicators, or EPI. And it is really sort of a research network bringing together scholars across a number of different universities and a number of different countries to essentially ask this broader question in different contexts and in different policy fields of what can everyday life in a local community tell us about very complex policy problems. There are a few different steps to this process, and I just wanted to go through those very quickly just to introduce folks to the process. So we start really with these focus groups, which last a couple hours, and it starts with the question of, taking the example of this current research, what are signs in this community that your community is safe or is not safe? And then from there, we unpack answers to develop very concrete and specific and very rich and detailed indicators that show the presence of safety or that show the lack of safety really in everyday life. And they are things like seeing kids play at the park. There are things like having access to food. There are things like having a safe way to get to school. In one of these focus groups, which lasts 1 to 2 hours, we'll get anywhere from 75 to 150 of these everyday indicators that are specifically relevant to the issue of safety in a particular community. Once we have these lists of indicators, we will bring a larger group of people together to do a verification process where essentially we say, okay, we had all these focus groups. We asked what safety looks like in everyday life, and here's what we took from that. Do these indicators make sense to you? And we go through the list of indicators. We edit them. We sometimes will, if one seems to be, have 2 indicators inside of it, or what we call double-barreled, we'll break it apart. And then what we can do with those indicators are a range of things. And this is where we get into the policy relevance of this process. We can design monitoring and evaluation systems to actually evaluate policy processes according to these everyday indicators. We can use the indicators to actually design policy processes or projects, depending on the kind of relationship we have with actors on the ground. And then we can measure those indicators. And so I was asking Josh and Hadar about alternatives to surveys. We use a lot of surveys in this work to, in a specific community, actually return, once we have these lists of indicators, and measure the indicators according to people's perceptions, to say, you know, how often do you see kids playing at the park in this community? How would you rate your access to food? Things like that. This is what the process looks like. This is from a project in Colombia that is underway. Unfortunately, I don't have any photos of our work in California. Again, because we just haven't been able to bring folks together in a way that's actually safe during a pandemic. But you can see, this is an example of a town hall where we have these lists of indicators that you see here in the background. I think in total, maybe there are about 300 indicators here. And this is actually a voting process where we read the indicators to participants and do a kind of participatory voting process, or what I've also heard referred to as dotmocracy instead of democracy using these little stickers. So then we actually have a kind of a framework that shows, you know, here are the indicators that people actually might be using or find relevant to understand and measure their own everyday sense of safety. Just going to conclude by speaking specifically about the first phase of this project, which is actually about to get underway in the next month in Oakland, California. In Oakland, we are working again specifically on the issues of community safety and community well-being with 7 different communities across the city. So I wanted to take a minute to describe what I mean when I say community, because it can be a very complex and loaded word. But essentially, the way this process works is we bring people together in communities that are relevant to their everyday lives. Sometimes those are geographic in terms of a neighborhood. Sometimes those are identity or language-based communities. Sometimes they're what we call associational communities. So here are the 7 different communities that we're going to be working with, that we are working with, I should say, across Oakland. So we have 2 majority Black neighborhoods, 1 in West Oakland, 2 in West Oakland, 2 in Deep East Oakland, a couple of majority Latinx neighborhoods on the Fruitvale region of Oakland. We have one particular neighborhood around, if anyone is from Oakland, there's a place called San Antonio Park where it's about a third Black, a third Asian, I think a third Latinx. So it's a really diverse neighborhood where it's people identify not necessarily, people also identify according to living together in this particular neighborhood, not only you know, according to a particular race or ethnicity or language. We're going to be working with several Southeast Asian communities. We're going to be working with groups of systems impacted youth. So that includes youth who are currently incarcerated and youth who are formerly incarcerated across Oakland, as well as survivors of sexual exploitation and or trafficking. Oakland is actually one of the epicenters of sex trafficking in the world. And what the combination of these communities gives us is a kind of citywide framework for measuring safety and well-being, but in ways that are very, very specific and locally relevant to communities when brought together in these ways. In Oakland, there is a very long and very rich history of confronting issues of public safety and policing in particular, dating back to 2003. Actually, the Oakland police went under federal monitoring and are still under federal monitoring. A couple of years ago, at the start of the pandemic, there was a process to reimagine public safety, which is what you see down here in the bottom left. There's a very, very active civil society in Oakland working on issues of policing and criminal justice. And what you, if I'm permitted to just just summarize and overgeneralize the kind of debate that reigns in Oakland over safety in particular, there's often a kind of a bifurcated politicized debate over defund the police versus more police, sort of, maybe hard or soft as approach to criminal justice, as Josh was saying. And one of the values that I think this approach has in terms of entering a context like Oakland, where you do have such a bifurcated politicized debate over safety, is it can add a lot of complexity and a lot of nuance to the conversation. So instead of this kind of either or, more police versus fewer police, what we get is a system where we have hundreds of indicators, which we then categorize into subcategories and then lump into categories and lump into dimensions, so that we can tackle an issue like safety according to the hundreds of indicators that we have to measure it, or according to the several dozen subcategories, or dozen or so categories, or even fewer dimensions. So there are different levels at which one can go in and try to measure these things. So I'm going to give you an example of what this measurement framework looks like in another context. So again, this is not Oakland. This is actually from that ongoing research in Columbia that I had mentioned. There we are looking at issues of peace and reconciliation, and we're able to categorize the indicators that we measured through the focus groups into these 6 global dimensions. And the reason I put this up there is not because I think it's necessarily relevant to Oakland. I think some of these probably are relevant to Oakland. I think particularly those dealing with culture and society, economic activity, rights and dignity and security. But I put this up there to highlight that this kind of approach that essentially starts with asking community members themselves how they measure particular concepts provides a very broad range and very holistic measurement framework. So this is all from a conversation about reconciliation, for example. And it shows, again, I think this really sort of recalls this public health approach to public safety. It really highlights many of those upstream causes of downstream problems like crime and violence, and shows various policy routes to start tackling these things that deal with diverse policy fields. Another thing it lets you do is actually compare neighborhoods. So for example, because we're doing this at a very local community level, a very local level, bringing together specific communities, we can actually compare, East Oakland, Deep East Oakland to West Oakland to show, again, this is a hypothetical, this is actual data from Columbia, not from Oakland, but that, in this particular neighborhood, notions of culture and society are particularly important to safety. Whereas, in this neighborhood, it's more about economic activity. And that can actually help, we think, policymakers tailor policy processes really at the local level. So just to conclude, while I don't have any answers to provide yet to the research questions I started with, I did want to end with what I think are some of the advantages of this approach. So by using this kind of everyday indicators approach, specifically in the field of criminal justice, I think the nuance that these indicators bring to the table, bring to public discourse, help move politicized conversations away from a kind of more versus less policing. I think they also have very local relevance that allow us to understand micro level differences between communities, again, defined according to geography, according to identity, according to associations. They also provide a valuable technology for augmenting community voice. So I talked earlier about this kind of technocratic language that, and Hadar, I think, very eloquently included this in her presentation as well, of the language that states like to speak. And it is a technocratic language that privileges numbers and countability. And by translating complex, hyperlocal everyday experience into these countable and measurable indicators, it can actually allow communities to kind of participate in that more technocratic conversation. And finally, what these indicators do is they really highlight the importance of a public health approach, spotlighting many of the upstream causes of violence and insecurity. That should not replace downstream indicators like crime rates or recidivism, but really provide a complement to them so that both the kind of bottom up and top down sides of the picture are being can be used together. We have more information about this on the California 100 website, and I can put this link in the chat, and I'll conclude there. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think our first question is from Josh. We said we'd let you guys interrogate each other, so Josh.
Thanks, Peter. That's just fascinating. I admire your work in this vein. It sounds so. What do community members in Columbia and Oakland tend to think causes violence? I mean, one of the things I value about your research is that when you ask community members what they really care about, they care a lot about violence. And there's a certain, I've already confessed to my more tough on crime orientation. There's a certain vein in criminal justice reform that just doesn't take violence and public safety seriously. And I think your research shows that the communities that are affected sure take it seriously. They really want violence reduction. They just have complex ways of thinking about violence reduction.
Absolutely.
So what I'd like to hear is what are community members' insights about the causes of violence and how would they like to see violence reduced?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I wish I could provide answers to that question in the context of Oakland, but we actually have not yet had these focus groups. Were this webinar happening, in 2 months, I'd have some initial results. But I can sort of, I think, speak generally to your first point, about those interested in criminal justice reform kind of writing safety and violence out of the picture. And I completely agree that I think that really does a huge injustice to community members and their lived experiences. I think, and this speaks to the point I was trying to make about, kind of more police versus fewer police, or defund versus, more policing, and the way that those conversations those narratives tend to be formed in cities like Oakland and, and in New York and really across the country now. There is, so in Oakland, and this comes more from our work preparing for this research in consultation with the community organizations that we're actually working with to bring these community members together. So we actually have 6 different community-based organizations that we've partnered with, who are all helping us bring together these community members to hold these discussions. And certainly in speaking with them, one of the main reasons they have actually been interested in this research is precisely to show that it's not a matter of, more police or fewer police. It's a matter of probably more police and many other things, because, homeowners who are dealing with crime and violence don't necessarily want to see fewer police. They want to see the police behave in better ways, or they want the police to come when they actually call them, which actually I think probably speaks to your point about sort of that another optional indicator in addition to surveys. So I think it's not an either or. It's very much a kind of yes and that's but you can't generalize that across the entire city of Oakland, which is an incredibly diverse city, and because of that diversity, has an incredibly diverse range of experiences with the police. So by tackling this issue, not only through this everyday lens, but also in a very local, community-specific way, allows you to kind of tease out some of those complexities and nuances. Where, for example, homeowners might feel differently, and where homeowners might feel differently, where you have differences of opinion based on age, based on race, et cetera. In Columbia, in terms of some of the, if I were to have to summarize in terms of what people talk about as the causes of violence, there too, I think there's a lot of complexity and a lot of diversity. And again, we're doing this at very community specific ways. But if I had to sort of come up with a universal conclusion, I think it would be a combination of actual more presence of state security forces in ways that actually respond to people's needs, right? So it's not just a measure, it's not just a matter of quantity, but also quality. So, in one particular village we worked in where there actually is a local police station, there were a lot higher levels of social trust, actually, that the indicators reflected. And we think it had to do with the presence of the local police, but presence of local police in the ways that people, they knew the 2 or 3 police officers who were based at that station. They would see them walking around town, right? They actually developed relationships with them. So it's very much I would say a combination of institutions that can provide that sense of security, but in ways that are respectful to people and actually respond to their actual everyday priorities. Let me stop there. I could definitely speak a lot more to that question, but I think I'll just end it there.
Thank you, Peter. I'd like to make sure we can have enough time for Michal's research, which takes a slightly different tact, but I think it's very applicable and may even answer some of the questions which have popped up earlier in the chat. So Michal, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Charles. I'll share my screen. Okay, good. So from the 2 very insightful presentations that we've just heard, one thing is clear that the added value of empirical research to policymaking is extremely diverse, and in my opinion, quite unlimited. And I would like to demonstrate this diversity further and highlight 2 more of the very valuable uses of data-based research to criminal justice policymaking. The first is understanding the unique needs and characteristics of target population that a policy aims to address. For example, in the context of this Salzburg initiative, we're talking about youth and children. The second is uncovering some of the long-term outcomes and consequences of policy decisions. Laws and policies affect individuals and communities in many different ways, some of which are less intuitive and harder to predict than others. Empirical research can help identify, evaluate, and assess these type of outcomes. There are several important factors that emerge from empirical studies that can inform our understanding of the issue of youth violence and safety, and the design of criminal justice policy that address this issue. To start with, children are different than adults. On average, they're physically smaller and more vulnerable. They're in the midst of their emotional and cognitive development, and their personality structures are not yet formed. Their brain and neurological system are still growing and developing. Their decision-making capacities are not yet matured, and they're largely dependent on adults for their survival and basic needs. We have now accumulated a large volume of scientific evidence which demonstrate that these differences are extremely relevant in the context of crime and violence and make children more vulnerable and susceptible to the impact of violence crime than adults. Children are more likely to be exposed to crime. Once exposed, they're more likely to suffer from more severe and long-term harm. Such harm may result not only from direct exposure when a crime is committed against the body of the child, but also from indirect exposure when a child is negatively affected by a crime committed against another. And lastly, children are less likely to recover without assistance. Another important finding to note is that violence is predominantly a learned behavior. As such, it was found that the single most predictive risk factor for violent behavior is exposure to violence during the childhood years that is not properly addressed. It was also shown that early intervention and treatment can significantly alleviate this risk and reduce the likelihood of adopting violent behavior during youth and adulthood. Based on national representative data in the US, we know that more than 64% of children living in the US are exposed to violent crime before reaching adulthood. I should note that these numbers are pre-COVID and are very likely to be higher today. We also know that despite the established value of early intervention and treatment in reducing the likelihood of engaging in violent crime, the vast majority of exposed children never receive such services. When looking at the impact of this failure of policies to effectively address the problem and provide children with the services they need, a large volume of epidemiological studies has found a strong association between untreated childhood exposure to crime and a host of adverse outcomes, starting with a significantly increased risk of involvement with the criminal justice system, both in the form of delinquent and criminal behavior, illicit substance use and abuse, and as repeat victims of crime. This adverse effect continued to extend to all facets of life, ranging from detrimental physical and mental health problems, as you can see here, to poor educational and employment outcomes. In addition of having a devastating effect on the life course of affected individual, these outcomes also carry with them a substantial spillover effect on society as a whole. With millions of children untreated and prevented from conducting a healthy and productive lifestyle, and with heightened risk for substance use and criminal behavior, community safety is inevitably compromised and public funds are unnecessarily burdened. Naturally, this host of adverse outcomes come at a cost. When talking about the cost of policy, we often measure the cost of solutions, the cost of taking action. We often assume that taking action is costly, but an inaction or a failure to act is free. In this project, we try to take a bit of a different approach and look at the cost of doing nothing, measuring the cost of the current status quo, which lacks an effective policy response to the problem of childhood exposure to crime. We developed an economic model to calculate these costs that, although applied here to the US population, is very transferable and can be easily used in a variety of cases and jurisdictions by plugging in numbers into the model. While I will not be going into the technical details here, I'm very happy to privately discuss with anyone the potential application of the model in different cases and localities. The model's design also, the design and methodology are also presented at length in an article that will be shared with everyone in the chat. So what we found is this. The bottom line, when being very conservative and including only the cost variable that could be established with strong empirical evidence, came up to a total lifetime cost of over $194 per person. And you can see in this chart the breakdown to different categories of cost. When considering the large number of affected individuals in our society, the total annual cost is estimated at nearly $500 billion every single year. That amounts to over 2.3% of the US GDP in 2019. So why is this important? First, it gives us an effective tool to gauge and demonstrate the magnitude and urgency of the problem. These findings can also be instrumental in developing a policy response to the problem that is both effective and budget conscious, as it allows us to compare the cost of doing nothing, the cost of the status quo, with the cost of doing something, in order to strike a balance between the two. From a preliminary look into the cost of the most common trauma interventions, which are significantly lower than the cost of the adverse outcomes associated with the problem, it appeared though we have before us an unparalleled opportunity for long-term savings in public funds. Although I personally find the moral argument that we are responsible for the well-being of our future generation and the safety of our communities more than sufficient to justify action, these financial figures can provide additional incentive for policymakers to act. Encouragingly, It has already proved helpful in the advocacy of policies in this field in several states. When pursuing policy advocacy, it is important to meet policymakers where they are. We live at a time where state budgets are stretched far beyond the limits and every dollar counts. We simply can no longer afford to waste $500 billion every single year due to inadequate and ineffective policies. So to conclude, just a few words about what we should look for in the future. One challenge that I repeatedly encountered during my work is the shortage of large national representative data sets, both in the US and in other jurisdictions. This makes it more difficult to produce findings that can be easily generalized to the population as a whole, which is very important when policies are concerned. Also, as you may have noticed, our world has drastically changed over the past 2 years due to the pandemic. Behavior patterns were significantly altered, which had particular substantial effect on criminal justice issues. Updated data is needed to capture these changes in order to inform relevant criminal justice policies that address current trends. Lastly, as we have heard today, there is so much that researchers and academics can contribute to policymaking. In order for this value to be realized, we all have to be very conscious and proactive about making research findings accessible, communicating them in a manner that is understandable to all, and maybe most important, developing effective mechanisms to disseminate this finding to relevant stakeholders in the policy world. And as a side note, I would like to thank the Salzburg Global Seminar for providing such a platform, which I think is really great. That is it for me. I'm happy to discuss with anyone the information that I shared in more detail and potential for future collaborations.
Terrific. Thank you, Michal. And for those of you who are watching a video and not here live, all of the links that Michal was referring to that got put in the chat while she was speaking are going to be posted online on the website, and link from the video when we post it. So I'm now speaking to the people who are not here right now. Michal, I have a question here from that Graham asked early on, and I think he asked it during Hadar's presentation, but I think it could be addressed to you, and maybe we can get a discussion between you and Hadar. But his question is, there a methodology evidence about how children under 18 years assess social trust, and is it still a predictor as it is for older people? So, obviously you're saying that the biggest single indicator for you is in violence is exposure to violence as children and how they react to that. We've also heard the other presentations about the importance of social trust. How do children experience and assess social trust, and how does that affect them as they grow up and move into the adult phase?
So I have not investigated social trust specifically, but I think there is very interesting research coming from Tom Taylor and Jeffrey Fagan about the process of legal socialization and how it's such a gentle and delicate process through which children develop this proclivity to cooperate with law enforcement and to comply with the law. And this process is highly influenced by all these experiences that children have with the system, with law enforcement, the ability of the police, for example, to protect them when they need protection, or their failure to do so, what they see on the street or how police officers behave. All these affect this process very much, and then will determine later on in life on the level to which they will choose to collaborate with the law enforcement and to comply with the law.
Hadar or Josh, do you have something to say about that? Hadar.
Yeah, actually, I don't know. I don't know. I never looked into specifically into the way that the children perceive, social trust and how much, if at all, what kind of differences there could be between the way that they perceive this kind of concept as opposed to adults, but I think it's a super interesting question. And Michal, maybe this is like a kind of a connection between these two studies, right? Trying to look at how to understand and to look at social trust in specific populations that might, might perceive it differently. So
there's a body of research on something called legal cynicism, which is a study of people's belief that state actors are sort of typically self-seeking, incompetent, or abusive. It would be interesting to find out when, and by the way, legal cynicism predicts legal non-compliance. So people who are cynical about the legal system tend not to comply with it. It would be interesting to see when legal cynicism sets in, like how early, and then how sticky it is. So do people become cynical when they're 10, 12, 13, 15 years old? And then it's sort of a lifetime cynicism that's very, very hard to overcome. What sort of factors lead to it? I'll tell you what I don't know what the research says about legal cynicism, like time of onset, to use some public health language. But I'll tell you what my intuition tells me, just my sense of other human beings. I bet legal cynicism starts young and is very sticky. And the younger it starts, the stickier it is. And so one of the things we would be interested in doing then is kind of giving people good reasons to keep legal cynicism at bay and seeing that as a real problem. Like that's a predictor of future kind of law breaking, but more than that, like a predictor of future difficulties in society.
Peter, do you have something to add to this? You don't have to. You know, if your research in Colombia or something was coming up with the effect on children and the violence.
Yeah, I'm ruminating. I'll form a thought.
I'd like to pass over to Gita Subramaniam Muni, who has posted a question in the chat. Gita, if you'd like to ask the question, you can turn on your camera, and then there we are. And Gita was one of our presenters 2 weeks ago in our last webinar on public health approach, whole system approach to justice. She's coming from Newham in London.
Hi everyone. So yeah, my question, I think, just following on from Michal, what we were saying about exposure to violence, and I'm a children's commissioner in a local area, and our children talk a lot about the exposure that they feel from the press and the media and the negative narrative that's played out about young people, and the way in which often, there's that kind of demonization of children, and, that kind of real excitement kind of media press coverage. And what that does for children who aren't necessarily involved in that kind of sphere of violent crime, etc., is actually increases their exposure to violence. And I was just interested in your correlation of exposure to violence, and obviously those things around domestic abuse and witnessing violence in the public realm and in homes. I'm just really, really interested in that social media aspect, as well as the press and the media coverage of violence, and whether that's having a kind of intensification of exposure to violence for our young people, because we're constantly on our devices looking at that kind of thing and engaging with that sort of stuff. So that was really my question. Thank you very much.
I wrote in there some of the answer in the chat because I started typing before Charles brought you on. So, but I'll reply verbally too. So the study I presented only touches only includes in-person exposure to crime. And there are many studies that show that in-person experience and real-world experiences have a greater effect than exposure through the media. However, exposure through the media still was shown in many studies to have an effect. And I think it's very interesting to maybe examine how this effect has progressed over the years, and especially in the COVID area. Some of the studies are maybe a little older and may have different results if done now, because as time progresses, media, social media, and press have so much more presence in our lives, which inevitably would increase the influence, especially in the COVID world, where, especially for teens, social interaction has transitioned into digital devices more than ever before. So I think it's the area that is still understudied and will be very interesting to examine this progression over time of the extent of effect of exposure through media.
One thing that I think, just responding to your question a little bit, Gita, is I don't think it's possible to do real empirical research, either original research of the kind Peter and Michal are engaged in, or research at one remove of the kind that I've been engaged in, without taking violence very, very seriously. It turns out that people's children's and adults too, exposure to violence and experience of violence is one of the most important factors in future criminal activity, their sense of whether their society is a safe one, and their future happiness. If you study what communities care about, it's violence reduction to a substantial extent. The lesson of empirical information is to care about violence.
Yeah, just to highlight that point, I certainly agree. I think one of the related challenges that I have found in my work is that in bringing people together to speak about their everyday experiences of violence, it can sometimes be hard to disentangle the kind of direct and indirect exposure, actually. Mostly because people aren't necessarily used to speaking about it in such terms. But there is certainly what often shows up in this work of everyday indicators is sometimes referred to as sort of as noise, sort of the general environment of rumors, media, etc., that will often sensationalize violence and especially pick up on particular moments of violence, particular incidents of violence, and reproduce them and often give them a lot of meaning so that people have a sense of a violent environment without necessarily having that direct exposure to violence. So I think it's one, talking about data-driven approaches to criminal justice reform, it's one very important point to disentangle, to understand actually how direct versus indirect exposure is actually driving actual violence or attitudes towards the criminal justice system. And it's not something that research participants or folks who are speaking to researchers necessarily will kind of automatically disentangle themselves.
I mean, then I guess a question on, just to be practical here, if you're trying to engage in criminal justice reform and there's a perceived increase of violence, and this perception can be from all communities, so it doesn't matter, rich, poor, people are affected by violence. I was recently in the United States and was surprised in some of the cities, like Philadelphia, for example. Everybody I came in touch with, no matter what their politics or where they're from or what part of the city, felt that the violent crime had increased during COVID. And there was a natural reaction against justice reform in general as a result. The crime is out of hand, let's get tough again, without looking at the specifics of whether or not this reform makes sense to actually reduce crime or so on. Nobody seemed to care about that. They just said, we're losing control. So how do you present some of these numbers in a way that is very realistic, that recognizes perceptions of violence? It doesn't even have to be actual violence, although I believe that the crime rates are going up in some cities in the United States. How do you address that from a research perspective, get that out there, make sure that the communities of all levels, the people who are affected by violence, are heard, and their lived experiences factored in, and get that to the policymakers in a way that doesn't then play out on the nightly news about, you know, duck for cover because there's so much crime going on out there.
Well, I'll give you my thought on that. I think the messaging has got to be both the messaging and the substance. It's got to be a both and approach. Here's something that makes sense in terms of effectiveness. Here's something that's humane and decent to offenders and community stakeholders and others. And here's why it also helps with the crime control problem. Here's why it would also reduce violence. I think it's always got to be that 1-2 combination of caring about violence and showing you care about violence, while also making suggestions that make the system more efficient and more humane and other goods. And on that note, more controversially, I think serious criminal justice reformers have got to cut ties with the those members of the criminal justice community who do not care about violence and who de-emphasize it at every turn. We all know who those people are. It's a attitude and it's a self-presentation, and it emphasizes it emphasizes the suffering of offenders, but does not have a counterpoint where it emphasizes the suffering of victims. It emphasizes racial justice, but it doesn't take crime control seriously. It's an attitude which is tends to diminish and de-emphasize concern with the things normal people care about, which is how violent their communities are. And I think that serious enterprises in criminal justice reform have to really diminish those voices and cut ties with those voices and exclude those voices, because they sap credibility from real criminal justice reform.
Charles, I want to just follow up and say that for me, you know, I think that just empirics many times support the fact that non-adversarial, non-punitive justice, you know, different reforms that are based on community-oriented solutions and that sees both victims, offenders, community members, families as humans, just helps to reduce crime, right? So we have lots of data showing that these kind of programs indeed reduce crime, and that's what I think policymakers sometimes, you know, it's hard to swallow it, because we have kind of an equation, you know, according to which severe punishment equal to, you know, reduction of crime. But we know it first that it doesn't always like this, and second that sometimes it's even vice versa. So it depends. I think it's more complicated. And once we break this equation and we understand that we need to look on how different, you know, programs really affect real people's lives. And we use this empirics and we use this data and we show this data and we lean on this data. That's something that policymakers would be able to, you know, to be convinced by and to lean on.
Perfect. Well, we're just
one more word about this. I really care about this. So Charles,
okay.
I hope you'll excuse me with a very short follow-up. You know, what you were describing in your visit to Philadelphia to see friends and family, that is a very widespread experience. You know, public safety gets out of control. People have a sense that things are slipping and they turn to tough on crime policies, which are often unproductive. What we need is to overcome the unproductive oscillation between tough on crime and soft on crime, and have policies that give you crime control with justice.
I think that's a very good place to end for today. And thank you very much to our great speakers. Thank you also to our partners, the MacArthur Foundation, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, the David Rockefeller Fund, the team at Salzburg Global. Behind the scenes, you've heard from Antonia and Helia Nazari, Antonia Bemek and Helia Nazari, my colleagues, who've really made this thing run. So thank you to both of them. And Ben Glahn, our Chief Operating Officer and Vice President, who was on earlier today, who's been very much involved in making this program happen. Ways to stay in touch with us: the recording will go up. You can subscribe to our newsletter. These links are going up into the chat. And you can follow us on Facebook and other social media. We are continuing the initiative going forward. So in 2 weeks, we have another webinar. This will look at education and youth safety. And we are going to have fellows leading the discussion who will be giving us inspiring examples from Chicago, Mexico City, Nairobi, and other places. And we hope you can join us for that one. And we also, as we move past these 5 webinars, we have another one on 2 weeks after that. We will be moving into the next phase of the project, and we want to expand the impact. So we will be having hopefully some in-person meetings now that things are getting under control with the pandemic. We will continue to have an online presence as well. And as we move forward in the next couple of years, we want to take this research, make sure that it is acted on or able to be acted on by policymakers, make sure the right policymakers are hearing it, and make sure the right research questions, the next questions, are being asked and moving on. So thank you very much for joining us today. We hope you will stay in touch with us. We hope you will join us as we move forward in this project over the coming years. And with that, I look forward to seeing several of you in 2 weeks for the next webinar in this series. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.